Are you a businesswoman who is finding it challenging to get your ideas across and make a point? Welcome to Speakers Who Get Results with Elizabeth Bachman, a podcast dedicated to helping women get the visibility they want, whether making a speech or talking in a meeting. Every week, get valuable lessons from Elizabeth or learn from her roundtable conversations with experts and speakers on how to make a difference, not just a point. On to the show with your host, Elizabeth Bachman.
Hello, and welcome to Speakers Who Get Results. This is Elizabeth Bachman, your host. On this podcast, we talk about leadership and presentation skills and creativity, particularly communication, and how you can be creative and own your creativity, even if you don't have the title. Before I go on to describing my guest today, let me invite you to see how your presentation skills are doing by taking our free 4-minute assessment at speakforresultsquiz.com. That's www.speakforresultsquiz.com. And that's where you can see where your presentation skills are strong and where perhaps a little bit of support could help you get the results that you need and the recognition that you really deserve. My guest today is Joey Tackett. And Joey is an award-winning creative director, career coach, and speaker who helps agency leaders and consultants become highly effective, confident, and persuasive communicators and presenters. And he has worked often in the creative agency space. That's basically the industry that he's worked in. But I asked him to come and talk to us because creativity is such a loaded word, and it's really easy for those of us who can't draw, like me. I have a hard time making my stick figures look like anything worth showing. It's hard to then accept that you are also creative and to own your own gifts, wherever they show up. The lovely thing about Joey is he had a 23-year creative agency career, and he's led creative teams at various size agencies, working with leading consumer and nonprofit brands to enhance their brand experiences, such as the Smithsonian Institution, Target stores, Southwest, CVS Health, and the American Jazz Museum. That one must have been fun. Being a visual designer and a creative copywriter himself, his agency mentorship and coaching resonates with agency leaders because he truly understands the work each person does on a daily basis. His agency leadership experience has helped him define and perfect his creative confidence framework, which empowers agency teams and consultants to become effective, confident, and persuasive communicators. He now leads his own agency, the Hey Joey Studio, based in sunny Los Angeles. This was a lovely conversation about art and creativity and the nature of creativity. I think you'll really have fun with this interview. On to Joey Tackett. Joey Tackett, I'm so happy to have you on Speakers Who Get Results. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's interesting because I get a lot of people who say, "Oh, you should have so-and-so on your podcast." And I go, yeah. And then every once in a while comes somebody where they've actually done their homework and they said, "Talk to Joey Tackett." And I said, "Perfect." So hooray. Very happy to be talking to you. Before we get into my long list of questions for you, let me ask you, who would be your dream interview? If you could interview somebody who's no longer with us, who would it be? What would you ask them? And who should be listening?
Yeah, that's a hard one, but I'm going to pick one person. There's many on the list.
Mm-hmm.
And that person is Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, actually.
Okay.
And yes, a name maybe you don't hear very often. A couple reasons. I was obviously not born when she was in office. And so it's really apolitical when I think about the Kennedys, and I look at more the Camelot brand that they created, because you may know, I think we've talked about this. I work in branding, and that has been my creative agency work throughout the years. And I'm so interested in how people create brands organically. And the Kennedys did that. And I believe Jackie did that. She led the Camelot brand. She created it. She invited people into the White House. She did that beautiful tour. She fought for the artistry in the White House. So it all started then when I saw that in the history. So I would have a lot of questions for her about that. And also, who did you have to convince? Who did you have to push through to get this done? That's one part. Obviously, we could talk about her later life where her philanthropy was really great, but I think that window is most interesting to me. And also how she handled it when her husband was assassinated. There are movies about that and other things, but the way that she moved through her personal grief to say the nation needs to celebrate this. And she was very meticulous about how that all the services went, how the media coverage went, and she did it justice. Even again, in the dramatizations of the movies, but I believe they're accurate. She got pushback on that too. Walking in the streets, being available, being public, but she understood that people needed to see them and build that trust. So that's why I think Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis is someone that's fascinating to me.
That would be a fascinating interview. And just to think about the people who were involved in creating a brand like that, and what was it like behind the scenes? I'm always curious about that sort of thing. So, wonderful.
Yeah.
I would love to hear that.
Definitely. And she was so private as well. I mean, she shared what was necessary, but she also is extremely private. And that is such an interesting thing when you look at our current state of social media and everything is public. And how would she exist today? How would that brand be built today? Would it have worked? Would the same tactics have worked? I don't know. But there was some mystique about the Kennedy era and specifically Jackie that's great.
I think that's probably sort of the last, almost not the last time, but near the end of when things were private. You wanted things to be private, they would be private. So it doesn't really happen anymore. So Joey, we were talking about creativity. And when we had a little chat before I interviewed you, we were talking about, well, I asked you, what is creativity? And then I'll tell you why I'm asking.
Yeah, it's a big question. Creativity, in my mind, is really boiled down to problem solving. And that may not be what people think I'm going to say, because my background comes from, I'm a designer. I'm a visual designer. I've worked in the agency space, and I am a creative. I have produced creative. This word is loaded, and we can talk about the loadedness of the word. But when you ask me what creativity is, the process of creativity in my mind is problem solving. And I bring that up because I think it's polarizing, because many people think I'm not creative, and they really are. They're associating it with visual design or the artistry or those kinds of things. When we talk about creativity, even when you look at the definition, it's this process of being creative. And then even baked into the word creative is this idea almost of innovation, which I know we've talked about, the difference between innovation and creativity, but it's this idea that it's creating new ideas. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think creativity is often about pulling something from the past that worked. I don't think it's always about new. I think creativity is about problem solving and really understanding what are we trying to get to and how do we best get there. And honestly, it's not always the most splashy solution. Sometimes it's the most prudent solution. And I think that's still creativity.
Okay.
So, yeah, maybe not what you expected me to say, but I could talk about the other sides of creativity as well, which I think are what people associate when they hear the word.
I'm really interested that you talked about creativity. People associate that with visual design. Exactly. And I'm wondering, like, the first thing I said to you was something about, I'm really great with words, but graphics, I don't have a hard time. So does everybody say that when they first meet you?
Yes, they do. And when I've worked in the agency space, which has been the bulk of my career, 23 years in the space, people hear the word and think, that's not me. They think of the creative professional. They think of the visual designer. They think of the person that's exuding what I call the brand of creativity. And when I say the brand of creativity, it's more that image, like we talked about with Jackie. It's this image of what creative looks like and feels like and what it means. And I believe that's often what people hear. And so therefore, in their mind, with that definition being true, they're not creative. Right? They're not a creative. They're not being paid to be a professional visual designer. That does not mean people aren't creative. I believe that is actually really problematic, because then when, I worked in many agency settings with clients as well, often when they say this, I'm not creative, I think it creates this divide between us and them that's not important. I'm sorry,
Mm-hmm.
that's not helpful, because they are able to problem solve as well, and everyone is part of that problem solving solution. Then the visual designer like myself or my team members in the agency, we can take it and do what I think people then associate with creativity, which is making it big, loud, splashy, adding the colors to it. That's creativity as well, though that's visual design. That's visual creativity. That's visual execution. It's one part of the bigger picture. And I hate that. I hate when people see themselves as not part of the process, because they are.
Mm-hmm.
They just need to understand you don't have to be a visual designer to be creative. You're a creative problem solver. You know what you want to get to. You can help us think through the solutions. And that's part of it too.
Yes. So I love that you say problem solving. So I always think my mother was an artist, and she could do cartoons, and they were sometimes painful. Just often she drew us a lot and it was painful, but she could draw things that looked like what she wanted them to look like. And that was never one of my gifts. So early on, I always thought I wasn't creative. And yet I spent 30 plus years creating in theater and opera. So being creative for a living. What I love you say about problem solving, because I do know for myself, some of my best ideas have come when I'm presented with restrictions. How do you make this work when you have these conditions? Like
Mhm.
you don't have this, you don't have that, you don't have the other. Okay, how could we still make something interesting?
Yes, this is a great question. And actually, this defines what I speak about and who I coach as well, which are agency professionals, agency owners, consultants. We always have constraints. It exists in the agency space. And I believe, actually, as you said, that often is good, because it can create these the fence around the yard, or the guardrails, as we
Mm-hmm.
say on the highway. It gives you room to work within something that is boxed in. And I think
Yes.
that's actually very good, because when you're problem solving, if you think about problem solving in its simple form, such as, we're driving and our GPS is not working now. How do we figure out where to go? You now are
Mm-hmm.
problem solving with people in the car to piece all of your ideas together to figure out the route. Very simple, right? At that moment, you don't want a lot of other things impacting you. You want a very clear path. You're trying to solve a very clear problem. So I believe focus is really important, actually, and makes the best creative work. That being said, I think within that process, it is important to have what is often in the agency world called sprints. So you could think of running. It's very much like that, where you're
Mm-hmm.
jolting for 30 seconds or running forward for 30 seconds and stopping. It's the same idea in the design world. It's called design sprints or creative sprints. And that is very important, because what that does, it lets the creative problem solving group run free for a day or an hour or some portion of a project, and they can get all the great ideas out. And then they know at the end of that, we're going to rein all those back. We're going to curate those ideas. And ultimately, everything's not going to be used. But the important thing is you get the creative spark out, right? You're not stifling the creativity. And I think that's the key difference here that I see often in the agency world with consultants. Probably a lot of your listeners, professionals are feeling this way. When you're stifled from the beginning, when you're told, no, we can't think big,
Mm-hmm.
we can't change the status quo. Those are negative to creative problem solving. I think
Mm-hmm.
those are not good. We have to understand why we have parameters. So an example of rules or parameters would be something like, the client has to do it in this time frame. We need to deliver this in the next 2 weeks. That's a parameter. Or budget is a parameter. We don't have enough
Mm-hmm.
resources to do the big thing. We have to do something else. So those are really useful, but that doesn't mean that you don't want to let the creative group really think big, right? And
Mm-hmm.
dream, because dreaming is what keeps us all excited. You talk about this in your podcast episodes as well. And I've heard many of your interviews where it's this idea of really just being tapped into your highest potential, your highest performance. We want everyone to be there because every creative, every person that's being creative on a project needs that. You need to bring that to the table because then you get the really best ideas. So hopefully that answers the question of it's a difference between stifling versus focusing or kind of guiding. Those are two very different things.
Well, I'm wondering, as you're talking about this from the point of view of somebody who works with design agencies and such, what would you then send to the rest of my listeners who work with design, who are the customers of, say, a design agency or the creative department in an organization, a large organization? What do you wish your customers outside the creative department would do? So first of all, what do you
Yes.
wish for? And then I'm going to say, what do you wish they wouldn't do?
Yes, that's a great question. And, patience is something we learn in the creative space. I've been doing this long enough that I'm patient, but that does have a limit, right? Because at some point, we do know what's going to make you, the client, successful. So even let's say we're talking and you're the example here and we're kicking off a project or an idea. I think it's really important for you as the client to understand what you're trying to achieve. So as I talked
Mm-hmm.
about the problem solving, we are both, or you, if you have a large team, it doesn't matter, whomever's working on this together, everyone is problem solving. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's important. And so when we kick off the conversation, that is the role that you, the client, are serving. I don't need you to be the visual design. I don't need you to necessarily pick colors. I need you to understand clearly what the problem is. And if we can't get there, then it's a huge problem from the beginning because we don't know what we're making. We don't know what we're solving for. So I think that is huge. And I think that plays out across the board with anyone. I think that's true if your listeners are starting a new position, right? Whether it's working with a designer or not, you want the same approach. You need to understand what problems are we trying to fix. You're usually being brought in to improve upon something, right? To turn a position around or turn a team around. So I think having that clarity is key. And I think every one of your listeners can do that, can understand what we're trying to solve. That is number one. And being able to clearly articulate that. And as long as you come to the table with that in mind, it doesn't mean you need all the answers. That's where I'm willing to work with you and help you get there. But not working with that is really hard, meaning I don't know. And this dreaded statement, which I'm sure you've heard, I'll know it when I see it. I'll know it when I experience it. That is one of the worst things you can say to any designer, just FYI, because we've heard it so many times. And if you tear apart that statement, it suggests if you're saying it, I don't know what I want. I don't know what I want. I'm looking, I'm aimless. Imagine in life if we said, I'll know it when I get there. Well, that's an aimless life. You're just meandering through. And I think that same lack of clarity comes across in that situation. And it's putting the designer or the creative professional, even if they're doing copywriting or whatever creative output they're making, it's very hard to solve that problem because you haven't clearly articulated it. So I'll actually provide the link for you as well. I did an article for the Forbes Agency Council a couple of years ago about this very thing. And you'll laugh, your listeners will laugh. It's kind of it's in jest, but it's kind of poking fun at this statement and how the woes or the pains that you're putting your designer through to have to figure out what you want. And so it kind of goes into it a little bit more.
We'll put that link in the show notes. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's fun.
So in terms of defining the problem, it's actually a very good point. If I often find that for visual things, I have a team that does that for me. And I don't know what it's going to look like, but I do know the sort of feeling I want it to, the kind of feeling, see what you can do within the parameters of the brand and do 2 or 3 versions because indeed I will know better when I know the idea, the sort of parameters, the visual parameters that are out there. Basically, I just don't have the time to go onto Canva and try 5 different colors and so forth.
Yeah.
I'd rather somebody else did that kind of exploring. When you're talking about being creative and creative solutions to problems, quite often a team is told, do something innovative. So we're going to have a brainstorming day because we are focused on innovation. Everything has to be new. And we could talk a little bit about the cultural implications of that too. But how do you see the difference between innovation and creativity? Or is it two different words for the same thing?
That's a great point. And I know you had done an interview prior with Jennifer Kenny, correct,
Mhm.
about this, which is great. I had re-listened to that recently in preparation for this conversation, because I think you go into that with Jennifer, or Jen, I believe you call her Jen, about this idea of what innovation means. And one of the things about that particular episode, which I find very powerful, is you explain, or Jennifer explains, how innovation is bigger than just inventing. It's bigger than just kind of coming up with an idea or creating something. And I totally agree with that, because one of the things that you touch on in that episode, which is innovation needs to be timely. And I think that's huge. And so let's build on that a little bit to say, that is exactly what needs to happen if we're working together on a creative project, right? We need to innovate, and we need to innovate quickly. The consulting world never lives in time frames where it's like, we'll just launch it when it's ready, because
Yeah.
that's just never happens. That never happens.
Mhm.
So there's a time frame. There's a speed to market that we're looking for. We're trying to compete with the marketplace, right? All these things are very important. And so I think with innovation, the key is, the words are very similar, but when I think about creativity, what comes to mind is, when people use the word in this case compared to the word innovation, they're looking for this wow factor. People say, I want it to be creative. And they're really meaning, I want it to have a punch. I want it to be exciting. I want it to be new and different. I want it to seem like something we've never done before, right? That's what I think
Mhm.
people mean when they say creative in that sense. And so in that regard, that definition of creativity or creative is very similar to innovation. But what I think is true with innovation, it involves more new ideas, honestly. When you think
Mhm.
about innovation, it's asking for coming up with something new, repositioning things in a new way. So in my mind, creativity, though, when you look at the definition, I believe in Merriam-Webster, it does sort of talk about creativity as this idea of coming up with new creations, though I don't widely adopt that view, because I don't think creativity is always new. I think creativity is often pulling from the past. If you look at artists, musical artists, film, reboots of shows, it's exactly that. We're reimagining the past. So in some ways it's new, but it's building off the best practices of the past. So I think if I had to tell you that, I think in this conversation, that's the difference between innovation and creativity. I think creativity is more about that overall package and what that looks like to the world, whereas innovation to me is truly something groundbreaking, something new, a new technology, a new way of imagining how to communicate with
Mhm.
people. That's how I use the word innovation.
I love that. Joey, how can we own the word? If you are in a department, say, that is not, or leading something in a department that's not specifically the creative department, how can we recognize our creativity that does not necessarily involve pen and paper and paints and canvas?
Sure. And I think you mean sort of in like a work setting, right? Like in an
In
agency setting or in a professional setting.
Yeah, in an
Yeah.
agency setting, in a professional setting. I'm hoping that everything that I talk about on this podcast translates at home,
Yeah.
but I'm really mostly talking about a work setting. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. And I think what's interesting is, I'll preface by saying that when we look at the word creativity, we've built out a bit of the layers of definitions that I have. And so I want to tell you the kind of the last piece that helps build on this, which is what I think is what I call the brand, air quotes, of creative. So
Mhm.
there's this, and if you think about that, this is what a lot of people are resistant to. So I'm a person and I dress a certain way. I come into the agency. I have cool glasses. I'm difficult to work with. That's what people think of with the brand of creative. So it's this
Mm-hmm.
person that's really trying on this persona. And
Mm-hmm.
in many cases, I'll pull the curtain back and say this, a lot of creative people put on that persona to feel more creative, to exude this brand of creativity. To me, that has nothing to do with the art of creativity. It has nothing to do with being a great visual designer. That is merely how you carry yourself in the world. So that
Mm-hmm.
aside, let's remove that. So often in the agency space, you're going to have these creative people that are exuding that brand. And you have to kind of look past that persona to understand that you all are more similar than you realize. And just because they have the name and the team doesn't mean that you can't use the word yourself. I think that's really important. And even saying in the agency setting, using the words different. You could say, I've often heard in agencies before the idea of big C, little c. We would say that.
Ah.
So big C creative is the team, the brand, the people, the work.
Mm-hmm.
It's capital. It's a thing. It's the package of creativity. Then little c creative was the process of being creative, and that involved everybody. And I
Mm-hmm.
think you could do that at your agency. And I think it would be very interesting to bring that up to, even if someone's listening today and they're getting pushback in their agency, the creative team or the design team is being really territorial of that word. I think connecting the word creative to problem solving is really big, to say, we creatively problem solved this, or we are looking at the creative problem solving aspect of this project, to delineate the fact you're not trying to say you're a visual designer. You're saying that I'm being creative.
Mm-hmm.
I'm coming up with a creative solution. We're thinking creatively about this, because everyone owns that. Everyone can do that.
Mm-hmm.
And good creative people, open-minded, empathetic creative people like myself and other people that I've worked with, won't give people a hard time in there because it's not inclusive. However, you're going to run into some people that are going to hold on to that, and because they're really owning that brand. And it's just the negative side of our industry. A lot of people really, want to be that person and be sort of in this elite category. But I
Mm-hmm.
think you have to look past that and realize, no, you're being creative as well. You're problem solving. You're part of the team. You're just serving a different function within the creative process.
I'm wondering where that image of the temperamental creative artist comes from, because we are so often, we put up with bad behavior
Right.
from someone who's supposed to be there to create, to come up with ideas. And
Yes.
30 years in that business, it seems to me that one of the things that I know is that I'm a pretty laid back, calm person. It took me a long time to learn the value of being calm in the middle of a crisis instead of having a big temper tantrum. But I remember in Italy, as an assistant, I was assisting a very, very famous director. And he threw a tantrum, and he took me and the other assistant with him. And we went over to the hotel room and sat there. And I said, I thought it wasn't that bad. And he said, no, I'm throwing the tantrum because that's the only thing that's going to get them moving.
Yeah.
That the Italian crew was being obstructive and difficult for some reason. And so we went over to the hotel room. I read a book for an hour, and then they had somebody come over and be sorry. And then we came back, and then we got some work done, but it was part
Right.
of the game.
Yes.
And we still see that now in
Yes.
modern life. I'd be curious your thoughts about that sort of thing.
Yes, that's a great question, and something that I enjoy talking about, because as I've managed agency teams, and my background is I'm currently running my own agency, and so I control run the shot, or set the tone and call the shots and all those things. But I've also worked in agencies as well as a senior leader, and built large teams and lived in those constraints, if you will, of what is involved with the culture. And like you mentioned, I know you talk a lot about culture, and I agree with you on those fronts of how important it is for people to understand what they're doing and how that's impacting the culture around them. So I think that there are people in the creative industry that struggle with, many people, as probably a lot of your listeners struggle with either ego or struggle with a broken ego, meaning they have imposter syndrome or they don't feel worthy. And so I think in the creative industry, that persona that you're picturing, Mad Men is the show here that was popular, I think, around the world, but definitely in the United States, kind of showed that in the 1950s and 60s, that kind of idea of where it started. But then you kind of go through now, you have Anna Wintour, who is the editor of Vogue in the US, who has a clear persona that's very tyrannical and kind of critical and very elusive, their personas. And I think that is important. And I think a lot of people embody those personas. So they see that, and the creative industry is so easy to put that on, to wake up in the morning and put that persona on because it's welcome, right? We are creative. In many cases, we are visual expressionists. We're creating visual art. So it's not weird for a creative director to come in with cool glasses, weird clothes, super fine suits, whatever it is, it's designed to separate them from you. And in many cases, it is designed, in my opinion, to put them on a pedestal over you. And I hate to say that because but it is that feeling of we're here and you're there. And I think that's just the nature of it. And, I think a lot of the newer, a lot of creative people are not that way. There's, billions of people on the planet, and many, many creative directors that I've coached and in my peer group are not this way. Though there are some that still, run their work that way. And that's just how it is. Though I think that is dying, that perception in the industry, because the newer visual designers and creative professionals that are coming out of school now, I've worked with many of them. I love working with young designers and interns and cinematographers. They have an open mindset. It's very inclusive. It's chill. They are not on a destiny to become the image that you're describing, that we're talking about, which I think is very encouraging. And I really hope that our industry doesn't make them jaded to become that, that we're able to let it become more inclusive.
Well, and it's interesting because I think in some ways it's a gendered thing that you're allowed to lose your temper if you're a white man, but a man of color, a Black man or a Latino or an Asian, if he loses his temper, then unless he's a big star, then he becomes a threat. And a woman losing her temper is out of place. I remember I tried it for a while back in my opera days, where I am naturally a fairly calm person, but I have a temper. And when people were stabbing me in the back, there were times I thought, well, this is how Mark and Stephen get respect. Maybe I will try it.
Sure.
Big mistake. Basically, I lost my temper. I actually planned it because it's not something I'm very good at. And either they saw right through me or they just wouldn't take it from a woman. And so I just said, this was back in the 80s and the 90s. So things have moved on since then, but it is one of the double binds that you think is, okay, this is also a gendered stereotype. One more question then is, do you have any tips for how to point out the value of a creative idea if it does not come with from a temperamental person?
So, do you mean someone that's balanced and rational delivering a creative idea?
So the value of a good idea that comes from somebody who's balanced and rational. Because often it's discounted.
You have to be the loudest in the room. I totally agree. And I think I'll just comment. I think what you said, I've seen that be true in the agency space without giving examples or details, where it's two-way street. It's this feeling that the culture is creating that environment where it's not welcome to speak up. And then also there's the feeling that if you're in one of the communities that you described, then you feel that you can't speak up. So it's almost this tension that's happening together. And I've seen that. And I will say that the teams that I have run and do continue to run, because I've built many teams throughout the years of different sizes at different agencies. And one of the things that I've always strived to do is to, number one, hire with diversity. And that is always a work in progress with diversity in mind. And I feel I've been successful in that, at least by focusing on it, that is there, and the teams represent that to as much degree as we could. What I think is important is, realizing that some of the best ideas come from the quietest people. And so when I would run these larger teams, and even now when I work with other creative professionals, you can very quickly learn who's going to be the loud person and who's going to be the boisterous person and the difficult person and who isn't. And I think really letting the quiet person speak up is important, and asking them in a meeting, what do you think? You over there, the quiet person, not calling them out as the quiet person, but pausing and saying, we've heard from the loud people. Let's talk to the quiet people. I learned that many years ago from, I can't take credit for this completely. I learned it from an internship that I was on, and the team leader led things that way. He would call it the verbal processors and nonverbal processors. And so, the verbal processors go, and they would make us stop and have 1 minute before anyone spoke to let the nonverbal processors think. And then it was an equal playing field. And then when we spoke, the ideas, they were equally weighted. But I think just as a team leader, as an agency professional, as a manager, you have to really make sure you hear everyone's ideas. I think that's the key. And then you start realizing that some of the best ideas are in that very quiet person in the corner, or they come up with a nugget that's so brilliant that was delivered deadpan, no emotion. And you think, well, they just revolutionized, they innovated, they created the innovation, they just revolutionized the entire thing. So I think it's very exciting. And I don't think anyone should just listen to the loud people or just listen to the difficult people. And honestly, I'll just tell you that I've done what you've described. Like, people that have worked with me that are listening to this podcast know that I'm by no means perfect. I've changed my approach in the past 5 years for sure, where I'm calmer, I'm more patient. But there were times where I was so worried about the deadline, or so worried about how the importance of this project, what was there, that I became that person, that this like tyrannical, screaming, yelling in the sake of perfection, right? Oh, we all got to get on board. And it never works. It never works. It always demotivated everyone. Nothing good came from that, in my experience. So I vowed to never do it again. And now I really set out, you don't need to scream to get something done, in my opinion. But there are still going to be people that do it, and they do have good ideas, and you can take their ideas, but don't forget the rational, balanced, calm people, because they have good creative ideas as well.
Oh, that's what you said. So much that's useful. I think I'm going to say, for anybody who's listening, who wants to think about owning their own creativity, look up Joey Tackett. We'll put all the links in the show notes. And if you're curious about how to talk about your quiet achievements, that it is actually a skill to solve a problem without making a fuss, contact me, because that's part of what I help people with. And we will go from there. So, Joey Tackett, thank you so much for joining us on Speakers Who Get Results. Listeners, this has been Elizabeth Bachman interviewing Joey Tackett. If you enjoyed this, please tell your friends, subscribe, follow us on YouTube, and do us a favor by going to Apple Podcasts and leaving us a good review and a rating, because that's the one that counts. So thank you very much, Joey, for joining us. This has been Speakers Who Get Results. I'll see you on the next one.
We have just concluded another great episode of Speakers Who Get Results with your host, Elizabeth Bachman. If you got value from today's episode, please feel free to share us with your friends and colleagues. You may also visit elizabethbachman.com for additional resources. Be sure to tune in every week for new episodes, and thanks for tuning in.